speaker is Professor Kishore Mahbubani from Singapore. As all of you know, I'm sure, he's the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. He's a prolific and dynamic author and commentator on political economy. He had, I think, almost 35-year distinguished career as a Singaporean diplomat. I'm a great fan of his. I had the privilege of debating him on theeconomist.com last year, a very spirited debate. I think I might have gotten the better of the vote, but I think he had the better argument. The title of his talk is The Next Tsunami, Asian Entrepreneurship. Professor Mahbubani.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. He's very modest. He actually won the debate hands down. Well, I'm actually not sure how to start with an audience as mixed as this. Because as you know, in America, you begin with a joke. In Asia, you begin with an apology. So what I'll do, I'll combine the two traditions and I'll apologize for my bad joke. But my bad joke actually is a true story. Many years ago, when I was the permanent secretary of the foreign ministry, one of my colleagues in another ministry, permanent secretary, went to China. When he arrived in China, he called on his counterpart, vice minister. And so when he introduced himself to the vice minister, he said, "I'm Mr. Tan, I'm the permanent secretary from this ministry in Singapore." So there was a young Chinese lady translator there. She looked at him. She was very puzzled. She sort of scratched her head, and then she said in Chinese, she said, "Well, this guy says he's Mr. Tan, and he says that he's the eternal typist from Singapore." So permanent secretary became eternal typist. Now, why do I begin with that story? If you can have cultural misunderstanding between Singapore, which is 75% Chinese, and China, which is 100% Chinese, you realize that we have a challenge on our hands. And the challenge will be enormous for all of us because we are entering a completely new world. And the one simple message that I hope will be the takeaway from my talk today is that we all have to prepare ourselves mentally, psychologically, for a world that we have never seen before. So what I'll try to do today is to answer three questions. First question, what is happening? Two, why is it happening? And three, what does it mean for you, I guess for all of us? And I'll try to do that in 15 minutes. So what's happening? What's happening is that we are entering a completely new era of world history. A new era of world history I defined with 2 points. The first point, of course, you're seeing the end of what I call Western domination of world history. But I hasten to add that the end of Western domination of world history is not the end of the West. The West remains the single strongest civilization for a long time to come. But what you will have instead is that you will have now, and this is my second point, the return of Asia. And why do I call it the return of Asia? I call it the return of Asia because from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies of the world were consistently China and India. So if by 2050 or probably even earlier, as Goldman Sachs projects, the 4 largest economies in the world will be number 1, China, number 2, India, number 3, United States of America, number 4, Japan, and 3 out of the 4 largest economies in the world will be Asian. Isn't it natural that the next tsunami will be Asian entrepreneurship. It's driven by the larger historical context in which we are living in. And this change is now inevitable. But of course, the big question is, why is it happening now? And that's the second question I'll try to answer. I normally, by the way, give a 1-hour lecture on why the world is changing. Trying to do it in 5 minutes is a challenge. But I'll try and summarize my points, because those points will explain to you why the explosion of Asian entrepreneurship is going to happen. So why is it happening now? It's happening now because finally the Asian societies have understood, absorbed, and are implementing what I call 7 pillars of Western wisdom. And the application of these 7 pillars of Western wisdom is transforming Asian societies. Now, I can't run through these 7 pillars. I'll just mention the first few of them. The first one, the most obvious one, of course, is free market economics. And the discovery of free market economics by the Asian societies explains the spectacular economic growth that you see in Asia. And by the way, even I wasn't aware of how fast things were changing until after I finished writing my book. I showed it to Larry Summers. And Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, sent me a wonderful paragraph saying, what's happening in Asia today is essentially a replication of the Western Industrial Revolution. But in the Western Industrial Revolution, you saw an improvement in living standards in one lifetime of 50%. Significant. But in Asia today, you're seeing an improvement in living standards in one lifetime, not of 50%, not 100%, not 200%, but 10,000%. This is a pace of change we have never seen in human history. And that's how China can grow from being, in a sense, one of the slowest growing economies in the world to having the fastest growing economy over the past 30 years. I was in China 30 years ago. Everyone wear Maoist suits, no cars, just bicycles, no neon signs. And today, if you go to China, it's the exact opposite. Why? Free market economics. And now, just in the past 2 years, you've seen an even more dramatic transformation happening, even as we speak, which is that as the Western populations have begun to lose faith in free market economics in some ways and have become frightened of free trade agreements, the Asian states at almost the same time are beginning to have become the biggest believers in free market economics and in free trade agreements. And that's why you have this rather paradoxical situation today where the United States, we used to give lectures. When I was in university, I had so many lectures from Americans telling us the best way to open up, succeed, is to open your economies and have more free trade. But the United States cannot ratify. The US-Korea Free Trade Agreement it has signed cannot ratify the US-Colombia Free Trade Agreement, which will benefit the United States more than Colombia. And at the same time, while the United States is paralyzed, the largest free trade agreements are being signed in Asia. The China-ASEAN FTA, 1.7 billion people came into force in January this year. The India-ASEAN FTA, 1.6 billion people came into force this year. The Korea-ASEAN FTA, the Japan-ASEAN FTA, January 2012. Amazing. So you can see that the biggest believers today in free market economics are in Asia. And if you are the biggest believers, you also naturally produce the most amount of entrepreneurs as a consequence. So what's the second pillar of Western wisdom? I describe it as mastery of science and technology. And I can tell you, as I was doing research for my book, I came across this amazing quote by a former Nobel Prize winner, Richard Smalley, who said, he predicted this some time ago, that by 2010, 90% of PhD holders in science and engineering will be Asian. Maybe it's not 90%, maybe it's 80%, maybe it's 70%, but it's still a remarkable shift that is happening. And of course, you get anecdotal evidence of this all the time, because as Tom Friedman said in one of his columns, when he went for the graduation ceremony of the Rensselaer Institute of Technology, he says when the list of PhD names were read out, their names began with Tan, Lee, Wang, Kumar, Kapoor, Rakesh. He said, finally one David Morrow saved the day. One Anglo-Saxon name. Amazing. And today you can see it everywhere. Third pillar, Western wisdom, of course, they call it the culture of pragmatism. And this is an important point to emphasize here. Somebody mentioned yesterday, indeed, this is the best definition of pragmatism, is what Deng Xiaoping said. It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or a cat is white. If it catches mice, it is a good cat. But you know what? This is simple common sense. But Asia is being overcome with common sense. The Asian states finally are learning from each other. So you have this dramatic march to modernity that began in Japan. From Japan went to the Four Tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. From there went to the ASEAN states. From the ASEAN states went to China. From China it's gone to India. And in the process, lifting up 3 billion people. This culture of pragmatism, this culture of learning is growing by leaps and bounds in Asia. And the fourth pillar of Western wisdom I describe as meritocracy. Now, I think each and every one of you understands what meritocracy is because you've been selected. The students, I mean, not the adults. The students have been selected on merit. You came here not on the basis of where you were born, but on what you can do. And if you want to understand and get the simplest explanation of why Asia is rising now, the simplest explanation is this. Asia always had the largest pool of brains in the world. But Asia also had the largest pool of unused brains in the world. Guess what? Now the unused brains are being used. For thousands of years in Asia, birth was destiny. If you were born an untouchable, you lived an untouchable, you died an untouchable. And you could never escape the destiny of your birth. But in India today, an untouchable child managed to get educated, managed to get scholarships, went to school, got a PhD, and is now the chief economist of the Reserve Bank of India. And his name is Narendra Yadav. But let me give you another example, a more recent example, because it's more relevant to all of you. Just in December 2008, 18 months ago, I was speaking at a similar symposium called the Pan IIT Congress in India. It's very impressive, by the way. As you know, the brightest people in India go to the Indian Institute of Technology. 1% get admitted. And this was a congress that brought all the brightest graduates from Silicon Valley and everyone back. And like in St. Gallen, when I went down there, a young student accompanied me and took me around. His name was Midun Salin. He had never been out of India. lived all his life in Kerala, managed to get in the IIT Chennai. And the reason why he was assigned to me was because he was going to go in January to become an exchange student in NUS, so they said he should accompany me. He arrived in Singapore in January, never having been overseas. While he was in Singapore, amazingly enough, he managed to get an internship in Canada, where he went to work at the Sanders School of Business to focus on cost-efficient treatment for end-stage renal disease. After returning from Canada, he got involved in energy. He won the Edison Challenge 2009 for his thesis on rural energy. And then he worked out a business plan, I'm just summarizing it, which won the New York City Economic Development Corporation Next Idea 2009 competition. And his team was offered office space for 2 years for legal and administrative support for starting the business in New York. This man would never have had those opportunities for the past 1,000 years. In 18 months, he suddenly won the world. And today, and this is of course going to make Joseph Ackerman very happy, he has currently taken up an offer from Deutsche Bank to work in the global markets division. So you can see how young minds that would never have been exposed suddenly get exposed globally. And I want you to imagine what the world is like when there's not one Midun Salim, not 10, not 100, not 1,000, maybe 1 million, maybe tens of millions. Minds that were never used for thousands of years are suddenly being used. And that's why you're going to have this great tsunami of Asian entrepreneurship. But something even more fundamental is now driving all this. As a result of the success of the Asian societies, as a result of the success of these young people like Midun Salim, something fundamental is changing in Asian minds. There has been what I call an explosion of cultural confidence taking place, an explosion of nuclear proportions. But because it's happening in their minds, you don't see it. But it's real. And it's driving them forward and giving them the confidence to do things and undertake ventures they would never even have dreamt of, even 10, 20 years ago. So the final question is, what does it mean for all of you or all of us? It means a lot, but let me suggest 3 things that it does mean. Number 1, if you are a young entrepreneur today, in terms of opportunities for partnerships, you've never had a better time than this. Because there are thousands or millions of partners waiting for you all over Asia, ready to find partners across the world. So these opportunities were not there 20, 30 years ago. Then of course it also means, frankly, as new entrepreneurs emerge, and by the way, one more statistic I can give you which is quite stunning, which is that at Asia's current stage of growth, if you just have a 10% increase in median income, which is quite easy to achieve, by the way, you get a doubling of the middle class. And with the Asian middle classes exploding, you have new markets for new products of a kind that you haven't seen before. New partners, new markets. And the third implication, of course, for you is that it's going to also provide you a new learning journey, an opportunity to learn about other societies and cultures. Now here, I'm going to say something that may be slightly difficult for all of you. One of the great strengths of Western liberal education is the belief that you can learn about everything and it's easy to learn about everything. In many ways, it is easy. But believe me, trying to understand and get to the heart of other cultures can also be difficult. And many Western businessmen, social entrepreneurs, business entrepreneurs, heads of corporations will have to begin to change their minds significantly to adjust to this new world. It's going to be difficult because suddenly the patterns of thinking that you've had, which work comfortably in a Western-dominated world, will have to be changed and retooled to accept this new world. And that's why I began with the story of misunderstanding between Singapore and China, because if you can have cultural misunderstanding between Singapore and China, just imagine how much more difficult it is going to be in this new era. And that's why I hope that as a result of discussions like St. Garland, we will have even more learning journeys. Thank you very much.
Professor Mahbubani, what a superb lecture, inspiring and eloquent as always. I wonder if we can jump straight to questions from the audience. I know there are many hands out there. How about starting right here?
Good evening. I'm Rohit and I come from India. I have a question on the first two pillars of the Western wisdom. The first is the free market economics. And I beg to differ on that because I think it's actually not free market economics. It's almost free market economics. Because the experience of the Asian economies with the free market economics was not that good during the Asian crisis. And even if you see China, it is it's partially controlled, although they are free market economics, but I would again say it's almost free market economics. The regulatory system in India is largely controlled still, I mean, the financial regulation. So I think that probably a more appropriate pillar would be almost free market economics and not free market economics. And the second observation or remark I have is, the second pillar that you said was mastery of science and technology. Now, I for one believe that the number of PhDs is not a good indicator of that, because it's actually the product innovations. Even today, I don't see a lot of product innovations coming out of India and China. It's larger process innovation. So I believe that even this needs to be modified and to be made to master of science and technology and master of commercial angle. And to accentuate this point, the person that you quoted was from IIT, but he's finally working for a commercial bank. So it's actually master of science and technology and master of business. So that's a remark.
Thank you. I agree with you that the Asian economies don't have perfect free market economies. But all I ask you to do is ask yourself what the base was 30 years ago. Take China. 30 years ago, the state did everything. The state decided what to produce, what to deliver, who would get what. And they went from that system, tightly controlled system, to allowing the Chinese people to decide what to produce. Believe me, if they had not done that, you would not have an explosion of productivity that you've had in China. And India too, you're right, started it much later in 91, 92, and there are lots of imperfections. But by the way, there is no perfect free market economy anywhere in the world. There are distortions in every economy. And the reason why we cannot complete the Doha round of trade talks is because of the agricultural subsidies in the United States and agricultural subsidies in Europe that are the obstacles to completing the Doha round of trade talks. So there are imperfections everywhere. But your second point about innovation is a very interesting one. I was asked by the World Economic Forum to write an essay for the Dalian meeting, and the title was, Can Asians Innovate? Because I wrote a book called Can Asians Think? And the articles on my website, mahbubani.net. Two facts. There's a foundation in America called ITIF, Innovation Technology Something Foundation. The ITIF documents that in terms of new innovations, new societies becoming more innovative, they point to the Asian societies doing more in innovation. And they gave the statistics. But statistics don't have as much an impact as human story. For me, it all came home when one day the provost of Harvard University came to Singapore and he asked to see me. So I said, sure. So he came to my office, he sat down, I said, I spent a year in Harvard. Everybody goes to Harvard. You as a provost, sit in your office. The prime ministers, the kings, and all come and see you. Why are you traveling halfway across the world? You know what his answer was? He says, I'm traveling now because I can see what's happening. I say, what do you see happening? He says, R&D is shifting to Asia. And in the year 2008, for the first time, the European Union spent $250 billion in R&D. United States spent $380 billion in R&D, and the Asian states spent $384 billion, for the first time exceeding United States and European Union. And all this is happening, by the way, at such a rapid pace that it is difficult for us to keep track of these changes. So my answer to you is, don't underestimate what Asia is doing, because Asia will surprise the world.
I think we have time for 2 more questions if we're efficient.
Hi, I'm Jay, again from India. So yesterday, Lord Griffiths talked of the growing anger at the differentials, especially in the West. Now, I personally think that the anger is not limited to the West, but it's probably even more in the East. Whether it is Dantewada in India or Xinjiang in China, a big section feels alienated, sometimes even disenfranchised from the governments, sometimes even more corporations, especially mining companies in India, and even the social sector. So what are the public, private, and social entrepreneurship that we need there, and what are the policies, and is there any other pillar of wisdom that should be learned from the West in there?
I must say that Indians ask very good questions. Your first point about anger towards financials. Actually, the thing that's surprising, and I think probably to some extent Joseph Ackerman can confirm this, whereas there is now a very sharp distrust of banking institutions or the financial sector, certainly in the West, and for good reasons, I would say the level of distrust is less in Asia. Partly because the Asian countries believe that unlike the West, which got trapped in an ideology which said that the markets know best, let the invisible hand do what it has to do and all will go well, the Asian states had always believed that you need a balance between the invisible hand of free markets and the visible hand of good governance. And as you know, yesterday I spoke quite a bit about governance, not because I wanted to, but because I was told to defend government. But in many ways, if you describe what the Asian countries have done, they have found the right balance. And therefore, with that balance in hand, there's less fear of the financial markets. But in terms of new models that you speak about, I think that for the next phase of Asia's development, as I mentioned, they have copied the West and done well in copying the West. For the next phase in Asia's development, you'll find the Asians devising pragmatic new solutions. And I would not be surprised, and it's beginning already, by the way, that you'll find more and more Western policymakers coming to learn from Asian policymakers on how to achieve the right balance. And that I suggest to you is also happening today.
Hi, my name is Bill English. I'm working on a PhD in politics at Duke University in the US. And I'm curious, given your extensive knowledge of Asia, where you come down on a debate that academics often have, that they look at Asia and there has been this extraordinary explosion of economic liberties, and that's unleashed the entrepreneurial talent you've talked about. but the growth of political liberties has been a little slower. So people, look at China and the recent Google incident, and many people argue as you have the economic growth, as you have a middle class, the political liberties follow kind of necessarily and automatically. Is that where you fall down, or is the political dimension really an entirely different dimension altogether that needs to be kind of dealt with and addressed on its own priorities and own terms?
Well, I think, I must say your question is an excellent one. And we could have a very long, involved discussion on the state of political development of the Asian societies. But let me just focus on China, okay? Everybody looks at China and says, in 1979, it's true, the Communist Party of China ran China. In the year 2009, the Communist Party of China runs China. That's true. So you assume that in some ways nothing has changed fundamentally. But from the point of view of the Chinese citizen per se, every ordinary citizen, 30 years ago, he could not leave his village. He could not choose his job. He was lucky if he had sufficient amount to eat. He had no access to information. And if you went to the universities in Beijing and Tsinghua, they looked like North Korean universities 30 years ago. Today, you go to China, 600 million people have been lifted from poverty. They now can choose their jobs. They can now travel around the country. And guess what? Each year, 30 million Chinese leave China freely. And 30 million Chinese return to China freely. Obviously, if China was a prison, they wouldn't want to come back to it. So the explosion of personal freedom in China has been phenomenal. And I think that the hardest thing to convey to a Western audience is to try and persuade you to stop looking at the world in black and white terms. That even though China may not have an elected democracy, right? It has changed fundamentally. And if you want to understand why the Chinese are moving so slowly, ask yourself, the United States is the world's most successful democracy without any historical baggage. It preached the idea of equality of man in 1776, and then took 100 years to get rid of slavery, which is the opposite of equality of man. Took 150 years to give women the right to vote. Took almost 200 years to give the blacks the effective right to vote. So a country with no history takes 200 years to achieve full democracy. China has got 3,000 years of baggage and a very traumatic 19th century and early 20th century. So you can understand why the Chinese are moving towards political change more gradually. The critical thing is that they're moving in the right directions. And if you go to Beijing University or Tsinghua University, it looks more like Sengaran University rather than a North Korean university.
Brilliant. Brilliant.